The sky over Rouen was the color of old pewter. Tommy Reardon remembered that more clearly than anything else. Not the roar of the engine, not the smell of burning oil, not Danny's voice crackling through the headset. Just that sky. Heavy, low, indifferent, like a lid being pressed down over the world. They were flying at roughly 5,000 feet, 8 Thunderbolts in tight formation, covering the bombers already turning toward their target somewhere ahead. Tommy was leading the second pair. Danny Cole, his wingman, 23 years old, from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, held position off his right wing, close enough that Tommy could make out the outline of his helmet through the canopy glass. 6 weeks in England, 4 combat missions. Nothing serious yet. The whole squadron had begun to carry itself with a particular swagger of men who have been told the thing is dangerous and have not yet been shown proof. Danny had been the worst of them, in the best possible way. The night before the Rouen mission, he'd sat on the edge of his cot and delivered a long, cheerful monologue about how the Luftwaffe was overrated, how the Germans were running out of good pilots, how the whole thing would be wrapped up by spring. Tommy had listened and said nothing. There was no point arguing with a man who was happy. He thought about that the following afternoon when Danny burned. It happened in the span of time it takes to draw a breath and release it. One moment the formation was intact. The next, something came down out of the cloud cover from the northeast, a dark shape, narrow, dropping at an angle so steep it looked like a thrown stone. Tommy caught it in his peripheral vision. 109. Where did he come from? He had no time for anything else before the German was already firing. The burst was short, professional. Danny's thunderbolt came apart with a suddenness that Tommy still had no adequate word for. Fire the color of autumn maples. Then debris. Then empty sky. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The German was already climbing back into the cloud before the pieces finished falling. Tommy pulled hard left and went after him. He did not catch him. The thunderbolt climbed the way a man climbs stairs after a long day, steadily, without joy. The 109 climbed the way a hawk climbs, as though the altitude belonged to it by right. Within half a minute the German was gone, swallowed by cloud, and Tommy was alone over occupied France with nothing but a hammering heart and the sky where his wingman used to be. He flew back to Ipswich, landed, sat in the cockpit without moving until Pruitt, his crew chief, climbed up on the wing and looked in at him with the careful expression of a man who already knew. "Cole?" Pruitt said. "No," Tommy said. 3 weeks later, he drove up to Duxford on a gray Tuesday morning and saw the German airplane for the first time. It was sitting at the far end of the dispersal area, half covered by a tarpaulin the wind kept trying to pull loose. The canvas shifted, and for a moment Tommy saw the nose, the long snout, the black cross on the fuselage, the yellow spinner on the propeller. He stopped walking. He had expected anger, had carried it all the way from Ipswich like a tool he intended to use. What he felt instead was harder to name. Something close to the feeling of standing outside a church you haven't entered since childhood. A reluctant awareness of something that refuses to be dismissed. The airplane was smaller than he'd expected. In the air over Rouen, it had seemed enormous, a force. On the ground it was compact, almost delicate. The fuselage narrow as a racing yacht, the wings short and purposeful. The whole machine had the look of something designed by a man who had thought very hard about exactly one thing and refused to be distracted by anything else. He stood there in the November cold and looked at it, and understood that the picture he had built from other men's descriptions had been accurate in its facts and wrong in every way that mattered. Facts don't have weight. The real thing did. He lit a cigarette, finished it, dropped it in the wet grass. Then he turned and walked toward the briefing hut without looking back. He thought about Danny the whole way. The interrogation room smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke. Henry Falk had been in England for 6 weeks, and he had come to understand that every room in this country smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke, regardless of its purpose or the rank of the men who occupied it. He had stopped noticing it, mostly. Tonight he noticed it again, perhaps because everything else in the room demanded that he pay attention to something else. The German sat across the narrow table with his hands folded in front of him. He was younger than Henry had expected. 22 according to the file, though he looked younger still in the overhead light, which was harsh and yellowish and kind to no one. His name was Klaus Weiss, Oberleutnant, Jagdgeschwader II, based until recently outside Cain. He had a bruise along his left jaw from the landing. The field he'd put down in had been rougher than it looked from the air, and his uniform had been replaced with British-issue clothing that fit him poorly through the shoulders. He sat in it with the careful dignity of a man who has decided that circumstances are beneath his comment. Henry opened his notebook, uncapped his pen, and looked at him. He had prepared for this. He had spent 2 days reading everything the RAF intelligence section had on JG-2, on Bf 109 tactics, on the standard profile of a German fighter pilot in the autumn of '42. He had prepared questions, methodical, layered, designed to move from the general to the specific without the subject noticing the direction of travel. He had done this 3 times before, with 2 Italian officers and a German bomber crewman who had wept steadily throughout and answered nothing useful. He had not prepared for Weiss to speak first. "Do you have a cigarette?" the German said. His English was accented, but clear, the vowels slightly flattened in a way that made Henry think of someone who had learned the language from books rather than people. "I have been asking since yesterday. No one has brought any." Henry reached into his breast pocket, produced a pack, and slid it across the table. Weiss took one, waited. Henry passed the matches. The German lit the cigarette with the economical movements of a man who has been cold and without small comforts for long enough that he no longer takes them for granted. "Thank you," Weiss said. "You're welcome," Henry said, and picked up his pen and felt the carefully constructed architecture of his prepared interrogation begin to quietly rearrange itself. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Henry had expected resistance, not dramatic resistance, not the clenched jaw silence of a fanatic, but the standard professional reluctance of a military officer who understood what he was and was not obliged to provide. Name, rank, unit designation, nothing operational. It was the sensible approach, and Henry had respected it in advance. Weiss gave him name and rank inside the first minute, then kept talking. Not about anything that mattered tactically. He seemed to understand, without it being stated, where the boundaries were. He said nothing about current strength or disposition, nothing about airfield locations, nothing that Henry could put in a report and feel useful about. What he talked about, with the slightly unfocused quality of a man who has been alone with his thoughts for several days and is relieved to have someone to aim them at, was everything else. He talked about his training, 2 years of it, rigorous and unforgiving, at fields in Bavaria and then in France. He talked about his first solo flight, which he described with a precision and warmth that Henry recognized as the particular tenderness men reserve for experiences that changed something fundamental in them. He talked about the other pilots in his Staffel, not their names, he was careful about that, but their personalities, their habits, the small rituals and collective superstitions that accumulate in any group of men who face the same danger together every day. Henry wrote it all down. He told himself he was writing it down because you never knew what detail might prove useful, which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Weiss was interesting. This was not what Henry had expected to find. He had spent considerable energy in the months since his commission constructing a mental image of the enemy that was functional, if not entirely honest. An image of a force, a system, an opposing weight on the other side of a scale. Not a collection of individuals with first solo flights and tent mates they were careful not to name. "How old are you?" Weiss asked at one point, with the directness of someone who has decided that formal pretense is more trouble than it's worth. 24, Henry said, before he decided whether to answer. Weiss nodded, as though this confirmed something. "I thought so. You look like a student." "I was a student," Henry said, "until last year." What did you study? Henry hesitated for just a moment. History. Something shifted in Weiss's expression. Not quite amusement, something more complicated than that. He drew on the cigarette and looked at the wall for a moment, then back at Henry. That is either the most useful thing, he said slowly, or the least useful thing for a man in your position. Henry wrote the sentence down in his notebook, verbatim. He wasn't entirely sure why. Walking back across the base in the cold and dark afterward, Henry turned the conversation over in his mind, the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath. The wind had picked up since evening, coming in flat across the fens, and he walked with his collar up and his hands pushed deep into his pockets. He had gathered nothing that the report would call intelligence. He had gathered something else, a texture, a human weight behind the machine that sat under its tarpaulin at the far end of the field. Weiss had flown that airplane, had sat where Tommy Riordan would sit tomorrow, had looked out through that same cramped canopy at the same sky over France, had made the same calculations of angle and speed and altitude that ended on one November afternoon over Rouen with Danny Cole's Thunderbolt coming apart in flames. Henry did not think Weiss was a good man or a bad man. He was not sure, walking across the dark field in the English cold, that the distinction was as useful as he'd been raised to believe. He thought about what Weiss had said, the most useful thing or the least useful thing, and found that he could not yet determine which one was true. He went to bed without deciding. Outside, the wind worked at the tarpaulin, and the German airplane sat in the dark, patient as everything that has already done its worst. Walter Cain arrived at Duxford on a Wednesday morning with a leather satchel, a thermos of bad coffee, and the expression of a man who has been promised something extraordinary and is prepared to be disappointed. He was rarely disappointed. This was not optimism. Optimism was for people who didn't pay close enough attention. It was precision. Cain had spent 15 years at Ford's River Rouge complex learning to look at machines the way a doctor looks at a patient, without sentiment, without assumption, with the specific quality of attention that sees what is actually there rather than what ought to be. It had made him an exceptional engineer and a difficult dinner companion, and he had long since made his peace with both. The staff car dropped him at the edge of the dispersal area. He got out, looked across the field, and saw the airplane. He stood still for a moment. Just a moment. Then he picked up his satchel and walked toward it. Flight Lieutenant Graves was already there, a lean, sandy-haired Englishman from the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit, who had the quiet authority of someone who has survived enough to stop being impressed by things that merely want to kill him. He had flown captured German aircraft before. He shook Cain's hand without ceremony and handed him a cup of tea from a battered thermos that was clearly superior to Cain's own. "She came in pretty clean," Graves said, nodding at the airplane. "Pilot put her down well, considering. Gear held, props bent on one blade, ground strike on landing. Engine's intact." "I'd like to start with the engine," Cain said. "Everyone always wants to start with the engine," Graves said, in the tone of a man who has heard this before and finds it both predictable and correct. "Come around the front first. There are things worth seeing before you open anything up." Cain followed him and did not argue, because the Englishman had the particular confidence of someone who was right. They walked around the aircraft slowly, and Cain let himself look. He had seen photographs, studied recognition silhouettes, technical assessments, the sparse intelligence reports that filtered through from various sources. He had built a reasonable picture in his mind of what the Bf 109 was. Standing next to the actual machine, he understood immediately and without resentment that the picture had been a rough sketch at best. The first thing that struck him was the sense of compression, of a great deal of capability pressed into the smallest possible space. The fuselage was narrow to the point of appearing fragile, though he knew from the reports that it was anything but. The wings were short, almost stubby, their leading edges straight and businesslike. The whole aircraft had the quality of a sentence from which every unnecessary word had been removed. "Willie Messerschmitt," Graves said, as though reading his thoughts, was not a man who added things. He took them away. Cain crouched by the undercarriage and looked at the main gear. Narrow, extraordinarily so, the two legs converging toward the fuselage at an angle that made him frown. "That's a problem," he said. "That's the problem," Graves agreed pleasantly. "We've watched them come apart on landing more times than I can count. Crosswind, soft ground, any surface that isn't perfectly flat. The gear folds, and that's the end of it. Kills more of them on the ground than we manage in the air, some weeks." Cain looked at the geometry of it for a long moment, working through the engineering logic in his head. The narrow track was not stupidity. He could see that immediately. It was a consequence. The main gear retracted outward into the wing roots, which kept the wing structure clean and simple, which saved weight, which was the whole point. Messerschmitt had looked at the problem and chosen speed and climb over stability on the ground. It was a rational decision. It was also, Cain thought, the decision of a man who trusted his pilots more than his pilots perhaps deserved to be trusted. "He designed it for experts," Cain said. "He designed it for the pilots he had in 36, Graves said. "The question now is whether he still has those pilots." They opened the cowling just before noon. Cain had uncrated engines before. American engines, British engines, once a French radial that had been retrieved from a crashed aircraft in rather poor condition. He was not a man given to superlatives, and he was aware that superlatives were often the symptom of insufficient experience rather than genuine excellence. He looked at the Daimler-Benz and said nothing for nearly a full minute. Graves leaned against the fuselage with his arms folded and watched him with the patient expression of someone who has already had this experience and knows its approximate duration. What Cain was looking at was not just an engine, it was an argument. A coherent, well-constructed, quietly devastating argument about a set of choices that he and every engineer he had worked with in Detroit had made differently. The engine was mounted low and tight, the lines of it clean in a way that spoke of someone who had thought about airflow not as an afterthought, but as a fundamental constraint from the first moment of design. Everything was where it was because it could not logically be anywhere else. He reached in and touched the fuel injection system. "There it is," Graves said quietly. Cain didn't answer. He was following the logic of it with his fingertips, the way a man reads a document in a language he mostly knows, slowly, carefully, arriving at meaning through effort. Direct fuel injection, no carburetor. The implications of it unfolded in his mind with the unstoppable clarity of a mathematical proof. Negative G-flight, inverted maneuvers, the nose-down brake that German pilots used to disappear when things went wrong. The move that Allied pilots had been chasing and losing for 2 years. Not magic. Engineering. "How long have you known about this?" he said. "Long enough," Graves said, and something in his voice suggested that the answer to that question was its own complicated story, and not one he particularly wanted to tell. Cain straightened up and looked at the engine for another moment. He was experiencing something he recognized from his years at Ford, the specific discomfort of encountering a solution better than your own. The moment when professional admiration and professional humiliation arrive at exactly the same instant and are briefly indistinguishable from each other. He closed his notebook. He would need more time, several days at least, probably more. There were things in here that he would need to draw out piece by piece, hold up to the light, think about overnight, and come back to in the morning. "Same time tomorrow," he said to Graves. "Tea'll be hot," Graves said. Cain picked up his satchel and walked back toward the billets through the gray afternoon, and did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. Tommy came to the airplane alone. The morning briefing had been pushed to the afternoon. The colonel from 8th Air Force Headquarters had broken down somewhere outside Cambridge, and Tommy found himself with 2 free hours and no particular idea what to do with them. He told himself he was just walking. The dispersal area happened to be in that direction. The tarpaulin had been removed the day before and not replaced. A young RAF airman stood guard nearby, stamping his feet against the cold. He checked Tommy's papers, saluted, and went back to his stamping. Tommy ducked under the wooden barrier and approached from the left side. Up close, it was different again. The nose longer than it looked from a distance, the yellow spinner catching what little light the morning offered. The canopy was propped open. He put his foot on the wing root and pulled himself up. The cockpit received him the way a new pair of boots receives a foot, with complete indifference to his comfort. He was not a small man, and the 109 was not built with his dimensions in mind. The seat was narrow, the walls close on both sides, the canopy low enough that he was immediately conscious of his own head. He settled in carefully, found the rudder pedals, rested his hands on his thighs, and sat still. The smell reached him first. Oil, metal, and something underneath, faintly human, organic, resistant to cleaning. Someone had lived in this space, had strapped in here morning after morning, and gone up into the same sky Tommy flew in. He looked at the worn leather of the seat and understood, in a way the briefings had not managed to convey, that this machine had a specific pilot, that Weiss had sat exactly here and shaped this space slightly to himself through repetition, the way any tool is shaped by the hand that uses it. He was sitting in another man's place. The instrument panel was organized differently from what he knew. Not incomprehensibly, but differently, according to a logic almost familiar, and therefore more disorienting than pure strangeness would have been. His hands kept moving toward spaces that held the wrong instruments. In a turning fight, his hands had to know without asking. His hands knew the thunderbolt. They did not know this. The canopy was the thing he liked least. From outside, it had looked workable. From inside, the framework was heavier than he was accustomed to, the pane smaller, and the view rearward was obstructed in a way that made him move his head experimentally, searching for an angle that opened up the blind spot. There wasn't one. To see directly behind him, he would have had to turn almost completely in the seat, which the cockpit walls and his own shoulders made very nearly impossible. He tried it anyway. He managed perhaps 3/4 of the way before the geometry stopped him. He sat forward and thought about that. In the air, the pilot who loses sight of his opponent loses the fight, usually within seconds, sometimes permanently. The Thunderbolt's bubble canopy gave him a view nearly unobstructed in every direction.
He had taken it for granted, the way you take for granted anything that saves your life quietly enough that you never notice. The 109 did not give you that. Which meant Weiss went up every morning knowing there was a zone of darkness behind him that his eyes could not reach. You could develop habits, constant checking, a discipline of the neck. You could manage it, but you could never make it disappear. He sat with that for a moment. There was something in it he hadn't expected. Not simply a weakness, but evidence of a bargain. Every choice that made this airplane fast and lethal had cost something. Messerschmitt had looked at the bill and paid it. The question was whether his pilots knew the full price before they climbed in, or whether they found it out the way Tommy found most things out in this war. Too late, at someone else's expense. He climbed down after 20 minutes. The cold hit him immediately. He walked back without hurrying, the morning fog burning off slowly over the fens. He didn't know precisely what he felt. The anger was still there, low and steady, the way a stove stays warm long after the fire has gone out. But underneath it, something had shifted slightly, the way furniture shifts in a dark room. He couldn't see what had moved. He thought about asking Henry. Henry had words for things that Tommy didn't. Then again, Henry had spent the previous evening talking to Weiss, and Tommy wasn't sure he was ready for whatever that conversation had produced. He put it aside and went to find breakfast. They took the cowling off on a Thursday morning, in a light rain that tapped steadily against the hangar roof and made the whole building feel like the inside of a drum. Cain had been awake since 5. He hadn't slept particularly well. Not from anxiety, but from the particular restlessness that overtook him whenever a problem was close to yielding. It was a familiar condition. His wife called it his workshop face and had learned over 11 years of marriage that the only cure was to let him work. He arrived at the hangar before Graves, before the mechanics, before anyone. He stood alone with the aircraft in the half-dark and drank his coffee and looked at it, and let himself think without interruption. The cowling came off at 8:30. 3 mechanics did the physical work, 2 RAF, 1 American. A young sergeant from Michigan named Dabrowski, who had worked on aircraft engines since he was 17 and moved around machinery with the quiet confidence of a man entirely in his element. Cain watched and occasionally directed, but mostly watched. There was information in the way a machine came apart, in what resisted and what gave easily, in where the wear showed and where it didn't. When the panels were laid aside and the Daimler-Benz was fully exposed, Cain stepped forward. The rain intensified briefly, drumming harder against the roof, then eased. Nobody spoke. The engine was, and Cain spent a moment searching for the right word before accepting the one that arrived, considered. That was the quality of it. Not elegant, not brutal, not innovative in any single startling way, but considered in the manner of something that had been thought about for a very long time by someone who understood both what he wanted and what the laws of physics were prepared to allow. Every component was where it was for a reason. The whole assembly had the density of a good argument. Graves appeared at his shoulder, tea in hand, and waited. "The injection system," Cain said, "when you're ready." Cain leaned in and found it, traced the lines of it slowly with his eyes before he touched anything. Direct fuel injection. No carburetor sitting in the airflow, no float chamber that would starve under -G, no mechanical reason why the engine couldn't be pushed through any maneuver the pilot was physically capable of surviving. He had known this from the reports. Reading about it and standing in front of it were different experiences entirely. "How long," he said, keeping his voice level, "have your people known about this?" Graves sipped his tea. "The girls at Farnborough figured out the basic principle in '40. From watching the combat footage, the way the Germans dove and we couldn't follow." Cain straightened up. "40, he said. 40, Graves confirmed, without particular emotion. Cain looked at the engine for a moment without speaking. 2 years. For 2 years, Allied pilots had been chasing German fighters into dives and losing them, and the explanation had been sitting in a report somewhere, and the carburetors had not been changed. He was not, by nature, a man who wasted energy on anger. Anger was imprecise and burned fuel inefficiently. But he felt something in that moment that was anger's more disciplined cousin, a cold, focused dissatisfaction that immediately began converting itself into the question of what was to be done about it. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, removing components methodically, cataloging, measuring. Dabrowski turned out to have a gift for mechanical intuition. He would reach for something before Cain asked, or pause over a component and say quietly, "This here is interesting, sir." And invariably, it was. Cain made a note to find out which squadron Dabrowski was assigned to and see whether anything could be done about it. The engine told its story gradually, the way engines always did. It was not a forgiving design. The tolerances were tight, the maintenance requirements significant, the whole system premised on having skilled men available at every turn. Cain had seen this pattern before in high-performance machinery. The engineer buys performance by spending reliability and hopes the men on the ground are good enough to cover the difference. Sometimes they were. Sometimes the production line outran the skilled men, and the performance stayed on paper while the real machines sat unserviceable in muddy fields. He filed that thought carefully and kept working. By 4 o'clock, the light through the hangar windows had gone gray and thin, and Cain's back was beginning to register a protest that he chose to defer. He straightened up, looked at the disassembled components laid out on the workbench in the order they'd come off, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had agreed to be understood. Not solved, understood. These were different things, and he had long since stopped confusing them. "Same time tomorrow," he said to Dabrowski. "Yes, sir." Dabrowski began covering the components with clean cloth,
handling each piece with a carefulness that had nothing performative about it. He simply believed that things deserved to be treated properly, which was the most important quality an engineer's assistant could have, and the rarest. Cain packed his satchel and walked out into the late afternoon. The rain had stopped, the field was wet and dark, the grass flattened, and somewhere across the airfield a single light burned in a window of the operations block. He thought about the carburetor, about the 2 years, about what a different decision, made by someone in an office in 39 or 40, might have meant in the air over France. He did not arrive at a comfortable conclusion, and he was not the kind of man who manufactured one when the evidence didn't support it. He walked back to his billet in the dark and wrote 4 pages of notes before dinner, and then wrote 4 more. Cain told them over dinner, not formally. There was no briefing, no diagram, no pointer and blackboard. Just the 3 of them at a corner table in the officers' mess, plates of something that had once been shepherd's pie, and Cain talking in the quiet, precise way he had, as though he were reading from a document only he could see. He explained the fuel injection system in 4 sentences. What it meant in the air took 2 more. The German pilot pushes forward on the stick, the nose drops, the engine keeps running. The Allied pilot follows, his carburetor starves, his engine coughs and cuts out for 2, 3, 4 seconds. In those seconds, the German is gone. Tommy listened without speaking. He had heard variations of this explanation before, in briefing rooms, from flight leaders, in the cautious language of men who understood the problem, but not its source. He had filed it alongside the other things he knew about the 109. Faster in a dive, dangerous head-on. Respect the climb. Practical knowledge, the kind you used and didn't examine. Sitting across from Cain, with the actual engine 30 yards away in the actual hangar, it stopped being practical knowledge and became something else. He excused himself before the others had finished eating. Outside, the night was cold and clear. The clouds that had sat over the fens all week finally pushed through by a wind from the northwest. He could see stars, more than you ever saw in Boston, where the city threw its light up against the sky and drowned them. He stood outside the mess door for a moment, his breath visible, his hands in his pockets. Then he walked to the hangar. The guard let him through without question. His credentials were in order, and there was something in his expression that apparently discouraged conversation. Inside, the space was dim, lit by 2 work lamps that cast long shadows across the floor. The aircraft sat in its partially disassembled state, the cowling off, the engine exposed. Dabrowski's clean cloths covered the components on the workbench. Tommy stood at the nose and looked at the engine. He was not an engineer. He could not read what Cain read in those cylinders and fuel lines. But he could think. And he thought now with a deliberateness he rarely applied to anything except the moment before a mission. Over Rouen, when the German had fired and climbed and Tommy had gone after him. He had pushed the throttle forward and pulled back on the stick, and the Thunderbolt had responded with everything it had, which was considerable. And still the 109 had pulled away. He had assumed it was simply faster in the climb, which was true, which was what they'd been told. But then the German had nosed over, had pushed forward into a shallow dive, smooth and immediate, without the slightest hesitation. And Tommy, following, had felt his own engine stutter, just briefly, just for a beat, as the carburetor caught up with the maneuver. 1 beat, perhaps 2. He had forgotten about it immediately because there had been other things to think about, and because at the time he hadn't understood what it meant. He understood now. In those 2 seconds, the German had opened a gap that the Thunderbolt's speed could never fully close before the cloud took him. Not because he was faster. Because the geometry of pursuit meant that 2 seconds at that distance, at that angle, was already enough. Tommy had lost him, not over the fields of Normandy, but in the drawing office where some American engineer had chosen a carburetor over direct injection, and the decision had seemed reasonable at the time, or perhaps had never been examined at all. He stood with that for a long moment. The anger was there, it was always there, but it had changed quality slightly, the way a fire changes when you understand what it's burning. Less hot, more useful. Danny was still dead. Nothing in this hangar changed that. But the shape of it was clearer now, and clarity was the only thing Tommy knew how to work with. He looked at the exposed engine one last time. Then he turned and walked back out into the cold and the stars. Henry was waiting outside, leaning against the wall of the hangar with his collar up and a cigarette burning between his fingers. "Graves told me you'd come here," Henry said.
Graves talks too much. Graves is English. It's different. Henry held out the pack. Tommy took one, accepted the light. They stood in silence for a moment, smoking. "Does it help?" Henry asked. "Knowing?" Tommy considered the question with more seriousness than he usually gave Henry's questions, which tended toward the philosophical and therefore toward the inconvenient. "It doesn't bring him back," he said. "No." "But yes," Tommy said. "It helps." Henry nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd been thinking about since his conversation with Weiss. Something about the difference between understanding and forgiving, and whether the two things were as separate as he'd always assumed. He didn't say any of that. He finished his cigarette and dropped it in the wet grass. "Cold," he said. "Yes," Tommy said. They went inside. On Friday morning, Cain took the wings apart. Not literally, the aircraft remained structurally intact, the primary spars untouched. But he and Dabrowski spent 6 hours working through the control surfaces, the landing gear mechanism, the weapons installation in the nose, moving through the aircraft's anatomy with the methodical patience of men who understand that a machine will tell you everything if you ask it the right questions in the right order. Graves brought a second chair and sat nearby, reading a report and occasionally looking up to answer questions. This had become the established rhythm of their work. Cain examining, Dabrowski cataloging, Graves providing context from the accumulated experience of 2 years fighting the thing they were now taking apart. The landing gear came first. Cain had thought about the narrow undercarriage since his first morning on the field. He had looked at it, understood the engineering logic, and filed it as a known quantity. Examining the retraction mechanism in detail revised his assessment. The system was not merely narrow. It was, in its own way, brilliant. A single-leg design that retracted outward into the wing root with a simplicity that Cain found himself admiring against his better judgment. Fewer components than the American approach. Lighter, cleaner aerodynamically. The engineer in him could not pretend otherwise. "How many do you lose on landing?" he asked Graves without looking up. Graves set down his report. "Enough that we stopped keeping careful count. Crosswind is the worst. The gear folds inward, and that's the end of it. Aircraft on its back, usually fire. We've seen it so many times it almost looks choreographed." Dabrowski, crouched by the left gear leg, looked up briefly and said nothing. He was from Michigan. He had the Midwestern habit of treating other people's misfortune with respectful silence. Cain looked at the geometry of the retraction mechanism and thought about the man who had designed it. Whoever he was, he had made a clear decision. Accept the ground handling risk, gain the aerodynamic cleanliness, trust the pilots to manage the difference. It was the same logic as the tight cockpit, the blind spot, the demanding maintenance schedule. The aircraft was a collection of deliberate bargains, each one made in favor of performance and against forgiveness. He built it for a war he expected to win quickly, Cain said. Graves picked up his report again. "Most people did," he said. The weapons were next. 2 machine guns above the engine, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. 1 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. All 3 concentrated in the nose, their trajectories converging at a fixed point ahead of the aircraft. Cain examined the installation without the complex feelings the engine had produced. This was straightforward engineering. Competent, rational, effective. The concentration of armament in the nose meant no convergence calculations, no spreading of fire across a deflection angle. You pointed the aircraft at the target. You fired. The rounds went where you were pointing. "Tommy said it hits clean," Henry remarked from the doorway.
He had appeared sometime in the past hour, notebook in hand, with the quiet habit he had of materializing in places without announcing himself. "It would," Cain said. "There's nothing complicated about it. That's the point." Henry came in and stood beside him, looking at the cannon installation. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was composing something, a thought, a question, a connection between things that lived in different parts of his mind. "Weiss said the gun was the part he trusted most," Henry said. "Said everything else on the aircraft required judgment. The gun just required aim." Cain looked at the cannon for a moment longer. Then he wrote something in his notebook and moved on. By early afternoon, they had worked their way back to the fuselage structure, and Cain stood looking at the internal framing with a particular expression Dabrowski had come to recognize as the one that meant the Major had found something that was going to keep him awake. The structure was light, extraordinarily light, in a way that forced Cain to reconsider certain assumptions about what a fighter airframe needed to weigh. The designers had found mass to remove in places where American engineers had not thought to look, or had looked and chosen safety margins over savings. The result was an aircraft that was, by any objective measure, lighter than it had any right to be given what it carried and what it was asked to do. "They took risks," Cain said, to no one in particular. "Consistent risks," Henry said from behind him. "Everything points the same direction. Light, fast, demanding. They knew what they wanted, and they paid for it the same way every time." Cain turned and looked at him. Henry had his notebook open, but wasn't writing. He had the expression of a man whose thoughts had moved slightly ahead of the conversation. "That's not engineering," Cain said. "That's philosophy." "Maybe," Henry said. "Or maybe it's the same thing, depending on what you're building." Cain considered that for a moment, then went back to his measurements. He did not dismiss it. He simply put it in a different part of his mind, the part where things waited until he was ready to think about them properly. Dabrowski covered the last of the components, straightened up, and rolled his shoulders. Outside, the light was going. "Same time tomorrow, sir?" he said. "Yes," Cain said. Then, "Good work today, Sergeant." Dabrowski nodded once, with the modest precision of a man who takes quality seriously and compliments in stride. Cain packed his satchel and looked at the aircraft one final time. The opened panels, the exposed structure, the accumulated evidence of someone else's thinking laid bare under the work lamps. He had the feeling, familiar from his best years in Detroit, of standing at the edge of genuine understanding. Not there yet. Close. He turned off one of the lamps and left Dabrowski to finish closing up. Henry wrote the official report on Saturday evening. It took him 3 hours and said almost nothing. This was not incompetence. It was the nature of intelligence reports, which existed to compress human experience into actionable data and had no mechanism for anything else. He wrote about the fuel injection system, the armament concentration, the undercarriage limitations. He used the passive voice throughout, as regulations encouraged, and produced 6 pages that were accurate, useful, and entirely bloodless. He set it aside and opened his personal notebook. He had been keeping the notebook since his first week in England. Not a diary exactly, more a running argument with himself, conducted in the margins of the war. His professors at the University of Virginia had taught him that history was pattern, that the historian's task was to find the shape underneath the noise. He had believed this sincerely, and still believed it. But the shape he was finding here was not the kind that looked clean on a page. He wrote about Weiss first. Second conversation, 3 days ago. Weiss had been more relaxed. The formal wariness of the first meeting had softened into something more like the guardedness of a man who has decided to be cautiously honest. He had talked about his training cohort, 12 men who had gone through flight school together in Bavaria. Henry had asked, carefully, how many were still flying. Weiss had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, 4. Henry wrote that number down now, as he had written it in his notebook then. 4 out of 12. And Weiss was in an English prison camp, which meant 3. He was 22 years old, and he was one of 3 survivors from his training class. and he had said it with the flatness of someone reporting a weather condition. Not without feeling, but with the particular exhaustion of a feeling that has been felt so many times it has worn a smooth groove and no longer catches on anything. Henry sat with his pen above the page for a moment. He thought about what Cain had said. He built it for a war he expected to win quickly. It was true of the aircraft. It was equally true, he now suspected, of the men inside it. The Luftwaffe had gone to war with the best trained fighter pilots in the world and had spent them with a confidence that assumed the expenditure was temporary. 2 years later, the training pipeline was producing boys who flew the demanding, unforgiving 109 with insufficient hours and paid for it on landing, on takeoff, in the first turning fight against a man who had been doing this longer. The aircraft required experts. The war was running out of them. He wrote 3 more pages, then stopped, and read what he had written. It was not intelligence. It was not history exactly. Too close, too unresolved. It was something between the two, and he was not sure it had a name or a use. He thought about Weiss saying the most useful thing, or the least useful thing, the remark that had stayed with him like a splinter, small and persistent. A historian in wartime. Useful because he understood pattern, context, the long logic of institutions and decisions. Useless because understanding was not the same as acting, and the war had very little patience for the distinction. He closed the notebook. Outside, the wind was up again, moving across the fens with the low persistence it had maintained all week. Tomorrow, Tommy would fly the aircraft. Henry had been present for the briefing, the route, the altitude, the chase plane that would follow at a careful distance. Graves had outlined the known handling characteristics with the calm of a man describing a difficult but manageable animal. Tommy had listened without expression and asked 2 questions, both technical, both sensible. Then he had folded his copy of the briefing notes and put them in his breast pocket and said nothing else. Henry had watched him and thought, he is not afraid of the aircraft. He is afraid of what he might feel in it. He wasn't sure Tommy knew that yet. He put his pen away, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark listening to the wind. Somewhere across the field, the aircraft sat in its hangar, patient and complete, waiting for morning with the indifference of all things that do not choose their purposes. Henry thought about 12 men in Bavaria, learning to fly. He thought about 4. He thought about Danny Cole, whom he had never met, whose name he knew only from Tommy's silences. Eventually, he slept. The morning came in cold and clear. Tommy was at the hangar by 7, an hour before anyone else. He had given up on sleep at 5:30 and lain in the dark until the grayness outside the window became something that could reasonably be called light. He dressed, skipped breakfast, walked across the wet field alone. Dabrowski had the aircraft ready, fueled, cowling replaced, the bent propeller blade swapped out 2 days prior. The yellow spinner caught the early light. Tommy walked around it once, checking the control surfaces by hand. Rudder, elevators, ailerons, feeling for anything that moved when it shouldn't. The aircraft accepted his attention without opinion. "She's good, sir," Dabrowski said quietly. "I know. Thank you, Sergeant." He meant it without qualification. Graves ran through the briefing on the hard stand, tea going cold in his hand. Chase plane, a Spitfire flown by a test pilot named Alderton, would hold 200 yards back and above. No aerobatics. No testing the limits. Get the feel of it and come back. "She'll want to climb harder than you expect. Let her." Graves looked at him steadily. "And don't fly her like she's yours. Don't ask her to be something she isn't." Tommy nodded and climbed up on the wing. It was different with the engine running. At rest, the cockpit had been close and melancholy, another man's space. With the Daimler-Benz turning over, it became something else. The vibration came up through the seat and the pedals and the stick at a frequency slightly different from anything he knew, and the machine seemed to gather itself around him with something almost like intention. He ran through the checks. His hands moved to the wrong places twice and found the right ones once. Better than expected. Alderton's voice came through the headset. Radio check complete. Tommy released the brakes. The takeoff nearly got away from him. The narrow gear tracked straight for 3 seconds and then developed a firm opinion, nudging left.
Tommy caught it with right rudder, felt the wheels skip once on the uneven grass, and then they were flying. The climb hit him like a hand pressed flat against his chest. He had been told, had tried to prepare. None of it had conveyed the physical reality. The aircraft went up with appetite, as though altitude were not something to be earned, but reclaimed. The horizon dropped away. England spread out below in the winter light, and Tommy pulled back slightly and the nose rose further, and the airspeed held without complaint. He laughed. Involuntary, without permission. He was glad no one could hear it. He flew for 40 minutes. Straight and level first, then gentle turns, testing the controls with careful hands. The Thunderbolt responded like a large ship, with authority and a slight delay you learned to anticipate. The 109 responded like a horse to a rein, immediately, completely, with a sensitivity that demanded equal sensitivity in return. Too much input and it punished you for it. Precision was not optional. Precision was the price of admission. He thought about Weiss, about what it meant to be truly at home here, in this cockpit, in this sky, hunting. Then he turned back toward Duxford. The landing was ugly. He came in fast, felt the gear threaten to fold sideways, corrected hard, felt the aircraft skip twice before committing to the ground. He rolled to a stop with his jaw tight. Alderton's voice in the headset. Nicely held. Tommy sat in the sudden silence for a moment. Then he climbed down. Dabrowski was there. Graves was there. Henry was there, notebook closed for once. Tommy stood on the wet grass and looked at the aircraft. Then he said, "It's the best fighter I've ever been afraid of." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. They sat in the mess that evening, the three of them, and for a long while nobody proposed a toast, or a subject, or any of the other social mechanisms men use to avoid sitting in honest silence. The whiskey was Graves's. He had produced it from somewhere without explanation and left them to it, which was, Henry thought, exactly the right thing to do. Outside, the wind had returned, working at the windows with quiet persistence. Tommy drank and looked at the table. Henry watched him with the careful attention he'd developed over weeks of watching men process things they hadn't expected to feel. Cain turned his glass slowly in his hands, around and around, the way he turned problems. Cain spoke first. "I'm going to write a full report," he said. "Engine, structure, armament, gear, everything." He paused. "Some of it is going to be uncomfortable reading in Detroit." "Why?" Henry said. "Because some of what they built is better than what we built. And the people who need to know that are the same people who don't want to hear it." He said it without drama, the way he said most things, as a fact that had been examined and confirmed and now simply existed. Henry wrote nothing. For once, he didn't reach for the notebook. "Will they listen?" Tommy said. Cain considered this seriously, which was his habit with questions that deserved it. "Some of them. Enough of them, I think. The carburetor problem is already being addressed. I made some calls from London last week. The structural lessons will take longer." He set down his glass. "These things move slower than wars do. That's always been the problem." Henry thought about Weiss. He would write his official report in the morning. The fuel injection, the armament, the pilot profile, the training pipeline running thin. 6 pages of passive voice and actionable conclusions. It would go to London, then Washington, then into the vast institutional machinery that turned information into policy at a speed that bore no relationship to the urgency of the situation. He would also keep the notebook. Not for anyone in particular. Perhaps for after. For the version of himself that would exist when the shape of this was fully visible. When the pattern could be seen whole rather than piece by piece from inside it. He had been taught that history was what you understood when it was finished. He was beginning to suspect it was also what you noticed while it was happening, if you were paying attention, and honest enough to write it down without knowing the ending.
4 out of 12. He thought about that number and what it said. Not about one pilot, not about one aircraft, but about a system consuming itself. The 109 demanded experts. The war was manufacturing the opposite. Tommy refilled his glass and looked at the window. He had not spoken about the flight beyond the single sentence on the hardstand, and neither Henry nor Cain had pushed him. Some things needed to be left alone until they were ready to be touched. "I keep thinking about the climb," he said finally. Neither of them spoke. "You're going up and it doesn't ask your permission. It goes." He turned the glass in his hands, an unconscious echo of Cain. "And the whole time I'm thinking, Weiss did this every morning. Some kid from Munich woke up and ate breakfast and climbed into that thing and did this. Every day. Over France." He paused. "He wasn't special. He was trained." "That's what makes it serious," Henry said. "Yes," Tommy said. "That's exactly what makes it serious." They sat with that for a moment. The wind pressed at the glass. The whiskey was nearly gone. What became of them, the records show, is this. Cain returned to England in January and submitted a technical report that ran to 41 pages. Portions of it reached the engineering teams already working on modifications to American fighter aircraft. He went home to Detroit in the spring of '44 and spent the remainder of the war doing work he was never permitted to discuss in specific terms. His wife said he came back different, quieter, more patient with things that didn't work the way they should. She considered this an improvement. Henry's official report was filed, read, and absorbed into the larger body of Allied intelligence on Luftwaffe capabilities. His personal notebook was not filed anywhere. He carried it through the rest of the war in his kit, added to it irregularly, and brought it home to Virginia in the autumn of '45. He taught history at his old university for 31 years. He never published the notebook. When his students asked him what the war had been like, he said, "Complicated," and "faster than you think," and "full of people who were very good at things that were being used badly." He thought that was accurate enough. Tommy flew 41 more missions. He was credited with 9 aerial victories, was shot down once over Belgium in the spring of '44, evaded capture with the help of a farming family whose name he spent years trying to find after the war. He flew the last mission of his combat tour on a Tuesday in August, landed, climbed out, and sat on the grass beside the hardstand for 20 minutes before anyone thought to disturb him. He never flew the 109 again after Duxford. He thought about it sometimes. Not about the fear. The fear had gone the way fear goes when it has been faced enough times that it becomes simply another condition of existence. He thought about the climb, about that involuntary laugh at 800 feet over the fens, the morning cold and the horizon falling away, and the machine going up as though the sky owed it something. He never told anyone about the laugh. Some things you keep.